All right. Welcome, folks. Welcome to our Fully Remote Talk Show. This is your only show for leaders who are navigating the remote first world. And we are on episode 6 of today's show, and we are talking today about resolving conflicts when fully remote. I know conflict is like a huge word, and like for a Wednesday evening, and I have spent a significant time of my career trying to avoid conflict or even avoid situations that might result in conflict until I learned that like dealing with them and going through them is what leadership was about. But now with everything going fully remote, it seems like the rules have changed, like how we talk to each other has changed, how we communicate has changed, how we build relationships has changed a little bit. And so how does resolving conflicts change when we go fully remote? And it's great that we have an expert among us, and like I'm gonna bring Laura, who is gonna talk to us and tell us about how we're gonna resolve conflicts and like come up with these processes. But before I introduce Laura to you folks, I want to take a moment to check in with all you people. Let's take a moment to say, how are we feeling right now? If you had a chance to just type that one word that describes how you're feeling. It could be a phrase, or it could be multiple words. If you think this is that kind of Wednesday where you are feeling multiple things, then feel free to type that and press enter. This is a moment for us to, like, this is a tradition that we do over here, this show, where we check in with folks, get to know what we are feeling personally, and then also make sure that we see what others are feeling. It's a moment for us to connect with everybody else here in the part of this community. For folks who are joining, Vincent, welcome. Just do a check-in on like how are we feeling right now, and in a moment I can see the word cloud of what everybody else has responded. 3, 2, 1, and excited, sick but stoked. That sounds fantastic. More coffee, that definitely is a feeling. Tired, happy / excited. That's actually really good. Hopeful, good, and positive. I really like this. This is pretty positive for the most part, except for maybe sick but stoked. But sick stoked part of it is good. So this is great. Welcome everybody to the show. No matter how you're feeling, I hope that like by the end of the show you feel a lot more positive than you came in with, and that's the hope. With that, I am going to bring Laura up here on stage and introduce us. For those who don't know Laura, Laura is a long-term expert coach who has spent decades coaching athletic teams, international athletic teams, and has also like taken that experience to coach leaders and executives and high-performing teams. As of recently, she works at Gradient Ventures, where she is coaching early stage and like even late stage startups in being highly performant. We are super excited to have you here, Laura. Welcome to the show. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Awesome. So we have a pretty packed show today. We're already at 5 minutes over, and I generally jump into this section where I ask some of the questions that is burning in my mind. But if any of you think that like you have a question that you want to ask Laura, feel free to post that in that section on the right. If you think it's like a very conflict-ridden question that you want to ask anonymously, there's a bar that you can check to make sure you have an anonymous question. Or if you're more like, this is a small group, I can just come on stage, raise your hand, we can just bring you up on stage. And so with that, I will start with like the first question over here, Laura. It's, how should we, this is about like conflict, right? Like, so how should we think about conflict? What is like really conflict? What are the kind of conflicts that are there? And like, what should we be doing to think about conflicts?
Absolutely. Any workspace will have conflicts. And I like to think of conflicts in 3 different categories. I like to think of task conflicts, and those are conflicts that are potentially come up between 2 people related to something that needs to be done. So I call it a task conflict. Personality conflicts, those sometimes also come up in working situations where people have different stress reactions to situations and are, and often in the startup world, people are under a lot of stress, and those stress reactions are directly the opposite. And so oftentimes those create what we call personality conflicts. And then lastly, performance conflicts. And this is a little bit more between a manager and their direct report, but when performance isn't meeting company expectations. So those three different types of conflicts need to be treated in slightly different ways, even though there is a fairly standard format for all of them. And unfortunately, as leaders, I don't think addressing conflict ever gets easier. You just get a little bit more comfortable preparing for those conversations.
Awesome. That seems like task conflict, personality conflict, and like performance conflict seems pretty good. Is there one conflict that's more better than the other, if you would say, among these, or if you were, which would make you feel less stressed than the other?
Sometimes performance conflicts are the easiest to address because they don't feel personal. We can sometimes, we can really, if we can really drill it down to a skill set. But oftentimes with task conflicts and personality conflicts, we can do the same thing if we take the time to peel away the emotional reaction and find the skill that's at the underlying core of the conflict. That's usually the best way to approach any conflict.
Got it. We have questions coming in, and I'm sure I'm going to take some of those questions, but we are going to talk about those parts over here. But before we do that, like I want to ask about like this whole remote first, right? Like we are like focusing more on the fully remote world, the leader who is like now adapting their style to a remote first world. Has things become different right now? Has it become better? Has it become worse? Like, is it become better because like I don't see you at all? I don't have time for a conflict with you? Or is this like, oh no, we are not communicating at all, and communication has become difficult? And so, what has been the last 2 years of experience taught us?
I think that I definitely think people are seeing a little bit less of personality conflicts because oftentimes our work now is so distributed and so task focused that becomes a little bit less in the forefront. Although in some ways, I think when personality conflicts do arise in the remote world, they can be slightly more severe because we make assumptions about people's behaviors in a remote environment that we maybe wouldn't make in a face-to-face environment, or we might have a chance to have that side water cooler conversation about it that isn't as organic in the remote world. And then lastly, I think performance conflicts in a remote world, usually performance conflicts show up a little bit later than they do in an office world. And so as leaders, we just have to make sure that we're checking in a little bit sooner on performance related things and task related things to make sure that that conflict doesn't build up and that we're not surprised by it.
Got it. Okay. We have some questions over here. So I'm going to take one of these questions, which is something that I have always thought about well, how can we avoid this? This is what I started my career with, is in like avoiding conflicts. So what are some of the main impacts of avoiding conflicts?
I think a lot of us avoid conflicts because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. We don't like confrontation. And I think oftentimes, unfortunately, as leaders, if we do avoid conflicts, number one, they get worse. Number two, they don't go away. We can't really sweep them under the rug. Number three, we start to lose trust in other individuals start to lose trust with us if we're not addressing conflicts that are impacting performance. So next layer is conflict does impact performance, and it really does create a toxic culture within an organization if it's not addressed immediately.
Got it. Cool. We have some more questions over here, and I'm asking a lot of questions, but I think that like maybe this is a moment for us to just do a quick activity, and I'm gonna put you over here in the spot and ask a question here, which is, what would you rather have? among these two? Would you rather have conflicts with your peers and managers, or have conflict with your team and the people who report to you? Again, the right answer for everybody is that like neither. But I guess if you have to choose between these two, what would you do? But you can go ahead and tell your answer, Laura. But I want everybody else to also like tell us what your thoughts are by clicking those two buttons over there and like what it is. And then once Laura tells us her thoughts, we can see how much of it resonates with other people as well.
So would I rather, this is a really awful would I rather one, but I think that conflicts with your peers and managers I'm a little bit more comfortable with that sometimes than I am with conflicts within my team or the people who report to me. Because when I have a conflict with my peer, it feels a little bit more in my hands. If someone on my team has a conflict with me, there's definitely like a power dynamic in there. And so I would much prefer to have a conflict with someone where there's less of a power dynamic in it.
Nice. I like that. And I think everybody else has voted on this. It looks like an overwhelming
Interesting.
people like to have conflicts with the peers and managers. And I think like, you know, this seems like your answer about like the power dynamic seems like it might have been what everybody else is thinking over here as well. And so let me actually like, you know, go on to ask another question over here. And in that, like when these conflicts happen at various levels, as we are seeing over here, like in this remote first world, like how do you seek for help, or should you even like seek for help or try to resolve it yourself? I mean, I guess, yeah, I'll stop there.
Oftentimes, I advise management teams to get on the same page about how they're going to approach conflicts and how they're going to try to resolve them. I think that's really critical in creating a stable company culture is to have a similar approach to solving issues. I think that in a remote setting, you can do it the same way that you would do it in person, and it really does start with accessing your network, talking through what you feel like are someone's strengths, what is the skill that is at the core of this conflict. And you might actually need to talk that through with a management peer in order to articulate that in the best way possible. Even when we're trying to address conflicts, we still want to think about like who is our user, who is the person that has the most to gain from this interaction, and that person is the employee or is the direct report or is your peer. And then ultimately the other stakeholders, the company, and people outside of that are affected by this. So it's hard to isolate conflict, and it's hard to address it solely by yourself because it is an uncomfortable conversation, and oftentimes we need to talk it out first in order to prepare well for it.
Got it. We have a question over here. What do you do if two people not reporting to you have conflict that impacts the larger team and the company's strategy? Somebody has a very specific problem over here, and love to know an answer.
Well, that's more like there's definite levels of conflict resolution, and this is definitely a personality conflict, right? This is something where people's approach to something possibly isn't aligning. And I would first recommend that each manager or two people that do not report to you, that each manager has a conversation with the individual and tries to get not to the nitpicky about the person, but what the actual core issue is that is causing the disagreement. That's the first step. And then those two managers almost have to run a mediation and figure out, is this conflict because of something that we're not doing at a higher level? Or is this conflict between the two of them something that can't be resolved? Is it something that could be resolved in defining a job description, or someone in management saying, actually, we really want it done this way? So it takes the conflict and the struggle away from the two of them, and management is making upper level decisions. And so sometimes personality conflicts are actually rooted in task conflicts and the way that individuals think things should be done. And then if there's no one above them making a very clear decision, then the two of them are left to debate it out. And sometimes it can turn ugly if there's no clear ownership of the situation. So, first step, managers discussing with individuals. Second step, managers aligning and deciding, is this a management issue, or is this a task related issue? What's actually at the core of it? Or is it actually two people who really can't get along? You have to start there.
Great. Awesome. I think this almost seems like there is a method to this, right? Like there is a process in place that you can put, and
Right.
especially as a leader. So, I mean, I think I have like more like the money question over here, right? Like as a leader, what is the process that you can put in place to like deal with conflict? Yeah.
Yeah, well, if you're thinking about task conflict, personality conflict, performance conflict, they all start, to be honest, in the recruiting process. As a leader, you have to have a very, very, very clear understanding of this person's lane, their responsibilities, and they have to have a really clear understanding of that lane and those responsibilities and what they're required or should have ownership for. If that's really ambiguous in the beginning, a lot of these conflicts come up really early because people just don't know what's expected of them. And so anytime we have any type of conflict, I always start with, what could I have done better to make sure that I was clear with this individual first time around, right? So first time around, we always want to look internal. Is there anything I could have done to give this person better direction, to be a better manager, to lay things out a little bit more clearly for them? And sometimes you have to redo that. And then second time around, if we're still dealing with the same issues, then we need to move on to a PIP or performance plan. First time though, the manager needs to take equal responsibility for the conflict and find out what they could have done better to avoid this conflict, so that it becomes a little bit more of a shared responsibility first time around. Second time around, then it's like, okay, we've been through this once. What do we need to make a little bit more clear? We probably need to define it a little bit better. Let's turn it into a PIP. And then third time around, you now have a pattern.
Got it. Okay, that's some clear takeaways over here as to like what is our like step 1, 2, 3 strategy of like being able to deal with this. And I'm gonna take a couple of these questions. This is like piling up over here. I think I think preparing for dealing with and talking about this conflict, right? Like, what is like communication tips? This is actually especially relevant when people are remote because you're not getting that personal thing. And so what kind of tips that you would give for this?
When you're preparing to have a tough conversation or manage a conflict, it's really important to think back to why this person was hired, what contributions this person has made to the organization, which are really positive, and also why you lean on the person, like what they're really good at. And I think it's really important for us as leaders to come into these conversations being really curious. What are your assumptions about this conflict? And what questions can you ask this individual to clear up those assumptions? And so when we head into the conversation, obviously, when we hired this person, we weren't expecting this type of conflict to arise. We never really expect conflicts to arise. And so we want to start the conversation with the things that the individual is doing well. And I know it sounds a little bit like a sandwich, but it's not. I promise we're going to pivot and do a little bit differently. But really setting the stage of, these are the contributions you've made to the organization. They're really great. Now, this is the skill set that needs to improve. And I often encourage people not to go directly to the example, but to go to the broader skill set and the larger picture. So it's not that the person's late to meetings, that is the outcome. The actual skill set and the way it's experienced by other people is that this person is disrespecting other people's time. And that reflects poorly on the organization. So we want to stay away from the micromanaging of the actual event and talk more about the impact globally of the skill of timeliness, right? So that's a little bit of a shift. And then once we get through the articulation of that skill, everyone is going to have an emotional reaction to being told they need to work on something. Sometimes it's embarrassment, sometimes it's frustration, sometimes it's a little bit of anger or feeling misunderstood. It's really important to give someone that space to react emotionally and then to go back and say, well, what are your career goals? How would this impact you long term if we can't shift or scaffold this skill, not behavior, skill, right? Even personality conflicts come down to a communication skill, a body language skill. It's a skill. It's not a behavior. And then we try to attach it to a goal that can get them headed back in the right direction.
Awesome. Yeah, I think everybody here nodding and listening to this is probably seeing the face of this one person that they are like thinking of like applying this to. And I went through like several of these faces over the period of my career as to like, that's what I should have done with this person or so. And I've had all these types of conflicts, right? Like the task conflict of whether, oh, this is my idea versus your idea. That like what we take is like what is good thing became like my idea versus your idea, like that kind of conflict, to like taking it to the personality where like I don't think I can work with this person. This is like totally not me to work with this person, and to do with like the whole performance conflict that happens all over the place. I've been on both sides of these things, right? So, so this is great, but. So I'm pretty sure like the rest of the folks over here have also like faced some of these things. So I'm going to shift and like see if we can just sort of get the wisdom of the crowd over here, do a small like a mini brainstorming of sorts where I actually what are some processes that you have put in place to ease conflict resolution in your organization? I think this is the prompt over here, and if you have ideas, feel free to type it over there. But also, if you think that you want to step up and talk about it, just feel free to jump in and like raise your hand and then talk about it. That's totally cool as well. I'm gonna give a few moments for people to like kick in. I'm getting some real pithy answers over here. Oh, shit. So, Laura, as you're seeing this, if any of these seem like it's catching your attention or things that you want to double click on, like please go ahead. Swearing jar, I think that's my favorite so far. I'm gonna press the heart button on that one.
Yeah.
Everybody likes it. I guess it's but any of this that like resonates with you, or anything over here that you think are probably a terrible idea that you should call out, please do so. This is anonymous. Like I don't think anybody is going to get offended, so feel free to like say if this is not something that makes sense. Like swearing jar is a terrible idea. Yeah.
No, I think it's hilarious, actually. I do think that a lot of what we're seeing on the left side talks about very clear communication and expectations. And we just have to remember as leaders, if we aren't clear, then we leave people to fill in the blanks for us. And the last time I checked, none of us are mind readers. And being clear does not mean micromanaging. And oftentimes we avoid being really specific and really clear because we feel like that might be perceived as micromanagement, when in all actuality, it's setting us up to have more conflict internally.
Yeah. This is some really cool ideas that are coming up over here. Meeting with tones and surprises to help people ease into the meeting. I really like that people are typing in, like, and if there is any one person who wants to like come online, I mean, like, just raise your hand, come in. We've been just hearing me and Laura talk over here. I would love to hear from somebody else talk and like share one sort of good thing that worked for you. Maybe just elaborating on the card that you just typed. Raise your hands, anybody? Hey, we have Vijay. I'm going to bring Vijay on stage. Vijay, what do you, please share. You're muted, Vijay. Can you please unmute?
Sorry, I hate silence and I just wanted to volunteer. So let's see how this goes. Couple of things which has happened in my past is one is establishing clear roles and a few of us already mentioned establishing clear roles and responsibilities for everyone who is involved in a project or a program. So we call it RACI matrix, which is like responsibility, accountability, who is consulting versus informed, so that not everyone has to speak up and take ownership and accountability, but there are like few stakeholders who have to speak up and make the decision on the behalf of the group, even though there are diverse opinions which we should invite, but there is one person who makes the decision so that things keep moving with regard to a program. That has helped and worked for me in the past. Personally, when it comes to conflicts, I usually, when I have had a conflict with somebody, I take them out for a coffee or a beer. Talk to me. That's the best way to resolve things. I mean, like, I have an open mind. I'll take all your opinions, but I would take it with a grain of salt, so that not everything I'll agree with, but at least it's a way to start having the conversation around it.
Great. Thanks, Vijay. Thanks for stepping up and sharing that. That was super nice.
They say that
have a quick reaction, Laura? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say neutral territory is a really great space to have conversations in general, if you can. I mean, I know we're in a remote world now, but if you do have that, if it is an office conflict, that change of scenery often helps.
Yeah, I was literally thinking about, like, how do I take somebody out for a coffee right now in the remote world, right? Like, that seems like an interesting enough conversation. We're almost out of time over here, but I just want to ask, like, one sort of last question. This is more like sort of predicting the future kind of question here for you, Laura, is like, do you think now we are still in like the early stages of like people just like adjusting to remote first, and like it's now become a thing right now? Do you think it's going to get worse with regards to like this conflict? Like, is conflict going to be a big reason why remote first is not going to work, or do you think it's going to have its own type of different solutions?
I think it'll have its own type of different solution. I do think that communication, like really good communication, often will stop conflict from happening or can at least deter it. And so as we move to more remote hybrid settings, the function of communication becomes much more important. Even though it was already important in the room, like in a real office world, it's even more important in a hybrid world. I just think it's going to become more apparent to us how important communication actually is. Whereas in the office, it was a little bit easier to kind of push it under the rug. I think this will force people to be more deliberate about setting expectations. I hope, at least.
Yes. Awesome. That seems like a really, really good kind of optimistic feeling about the future. And I really like that part over here. I think with that, like, we are coming towards the end of the show. Thank you so much for everybody who joined. Before you take off, I would love for you to just like type one top takeaway for you from that box on the right over there, so we can learn from what is interesting for you. And Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to hear your thoughts, and I'm guessing everybody here learned a trick or two, or at least a framework that they can use in their real world. Thank you again. Yeah, folks, feel free to hang out over here. I know that I'm going to hang out over here for a little bit more longer. If you want to chat casually, this is totally fine, cool. Any other random thoughts are fine. I'm stopping.